I'm Brady Berserker.
I'm Big Sexy Brian Bales.
And I'm Metal Matson from Super Geeky Playdate,
a podcast member of the Gonna Geek Network.
Just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual host.
Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
And get ready, because geekiness begins in
3, 2,
1.
Liftoff for episode 136 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we'll discuss how distilled your podcast audio needs to be in 2018.
In this week's Better Podcasting download, we explore Google's brand spanking new hot off the press podcast app.
And finally, in this week's Better Pod Back, we review what you had to say about downloading podcasts.
Lauren, start the show now. We all know that I'm not brand spanking new.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your hosts for the show, Stephen John Drew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 136 of Better Podcasting. I am Stephen John Drew, and with me, of course, is the away Stargate Pioneer.
Do you mean like away, like he's going away, or he has gone away, or he's playing an away game? What do you mean by away?
I meant that you're mentally checked out today. That's what I meant.
That's every day. How is today any different than any other day?
No, for those of you who are astute to the audio, you might hear Stargate Pioneer sound a little bit different. In my opinion, he sounds a little bit better because he's a bit further away from his microphone this time, so that's always a plus.
A bit further away? You mean I'm not eating it?
Yeah, no, Stargate Pioneer's on the road. You're in a hotel. And for those of you who are not watching the video side of things at youtube.com/GonnaGeek or betterpodcasting.com, you won't know that Stargate Pioneer actually, he travels well. He brought his Gonna Geek Network banner. He has that set up behind him. So there's no half-ass with Stargate Pioneer.
Apparently not. You know, I get a present and I think I might as well use it every once in a while when I do. So I had the opportunity to travel. I had the opportunity to drive when I was traveling. Actually, I didn't have the opportunity. I was told you are going, so I went. But I brought the banner with me and I thought, hey, we might as well use it. I don't know. It might be better for the lighting. Who knows? And you might consider this a way to save my podcast because I've been saving my background, you know, my usual studio feel. I at least have a part of it with me. And what we normally do on the show is we talk about how you have saved your podcast stories. But since we don't have one this week, we're going to delve back into Reddit and we're going to talk about how I could have saved my podcast story. Now, this Reddit post was titled, "Looking to Leave WordPress. Advice? Help a teacher out." And the post continues by saying, "Last week, my podcast website, a small show on world history, pedology, and research for teachers, was hacked with some malware redirects. I restored the site from a backup, updated all the things, etc., etc. 2 days later, it was infected again. I called Bluehost Security Division and found out that it's some kind of automated bot and it's just going to keep happening until the bot, quote, gets bored, unquote. Their solution is a $100 per month firewall. Our show is funded by a very small grant and we can't afford this. I've read WordPress is especially vulnerable to this kind of hack. After lots of time on the phone with Bluehost and more time trying to clean and fix the site myself, I'm ready to bail. What suggestions does the community have for alternative hosting for both the podcast and the domain? Are there any hosting services that make importing WordPress easy, like Squarespace or Wix? This site is short essays and lesson plans with some PDF files, along with the podcast episode descriptions with MP3. The podcast is called On Top of the World History, for anyone who is curious, but don't go to the domain because, you know, the malware. I've read good things about Podbean and Libsyn. Bluehost gives us no stats, and the silver lining of this could be some actual info on our downloads. TLDR, podcasts on WordPress/Bluehost keeps getting hacked. What are your recommendations for a new host? Stephen, you are the WordPress expert on this podcast, and I will turn it over to you to give an answer.
Well, number one, let me just go ahead and say that if you are at all considering that maybe a media host like Podbean or Libsyn would suffice, I would consider that first. Look at what you've got on your website and think, can this actually translate over? Some of these sites can actually be expanded quite a bit. And if they can, then it's a good idea to consider going that way because they are a little less likely to be hacked. Now, I stop short of saying that they're less hackable. I just think that it's the whole Mac thing. If you think back years ago, a long time ago, everybody said that a Mac is virus free. That's not true anymore. I'll argue with anybody who says that a Mac is virus free because at the time, the Mac percentage was so little that, and there was of course less plugins and things like that, that obviously it's less of a target. Then of course the actual Mac desktop client base got larger. And so then it became a little more appealing to put malware on. And now you do have problems on Mac. It's the same thing in a sense with these media hosts. They're not as big as WordPress. WordPress is massive. So of course there's going to be more eyes trying to find these vulnerabilities. I'm not saying that Podbean or Libsyn at all is vulnerable. I'm just saying that that's part of the factor is that they're not so big as WordPress that they're as big of a target. Now it helps, of course, that there's a lot less like plugins and a lot less customization and stuff like that. So yes, those avenues to possibly hack are not there. So I would say start by looking at that and see if you can do that. And if you can, you might as well switch over and take advantage because they're going to generally they cover you pretty good. And usually they're pretty good at helping you in weird situations. And we haven't heard of a big hack story out of these people yet. So that's why I say they're a little bit safer. Now, on the flip side, I would say if you want to keep using WordPress, because it might just not be for you. One of these media host sites might not be for you. Look at some of these hosting providers, go to webhostingtalk.com and see if they offer a WordPress version. And a lot of those have a sort of a hack prevention or a hack guarantee. I know that there's a lot of people that do actually manage the WordPress installations because you pay a little bit more. And so when you pay a bit more, they will manage it in a situation and help prevent you from getting hacked. And if you do get hacked, help you solve it. Of course, from the WordPress side of things, you want to make sure that all of your plugins are up to date and your themes are up to date, because if they're not, or you're using something that has been updated in a long time, there's a chance that it's vulnerable. First thing as well, by the way, if you ever have this happen, is I say go ahead and back things up. Don't necessarily open up that backup, but back things up right away and change all of your password, not just your WordPress password, but also if you have a control panel to your login, whether it's cPanel or it's an actual hosting login through your hosting provider, change all of these passwords. As well, if you do use cPanel, look to see if two-factor authentication is an option. Some web hosts do offer that now. And so it's just an extra security step if they're getting in through your cPanel installation, which the cPanel installation is essentially the web admin to the entire web hosting. So that's sort of my tips. I would start if you're considering a media host. If you can do it, just go that way. It'll be easier.
And if you are considering a media host provider, Libsyn is great because if you halt production for a little bit, like you go dormant during the school year and you're really producing when the school year is out, you can throttle that plan back to $5 a month and then gen it back up as you're producing more. So you can vary the rate of your payment. Otherwise, I agree with everything that Mr. Stephen had to say.
And it is interesting how more and more of these web hosts are actually making hack guarantee or hack prevention or hack help a whole selling feature, because it is happening more and more. And so, of course, they're going to try to capitalize on it. You know, that's the service, right? You pay for service.
You pay a lot for service, apparently. And for $100 a month, I hope that it would be hack free. But something in my back of my mind tells me that the harder it is, the more advanced hackers are going to be coming after the hack proof program in general, maybe not your website, but as soon as the hack is out there and they do get out there into the dark web, then a bunch of other people will try it as well. So nothing's really safe these days, and it's just the way of the web now.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about audio standards. Here we go.
Here at Better Podcasting, we often talk about why we believe podcast quality is important, but we also have said that if you don't need to sound like you spend several thousands of dollars on an episode on your production, and that it just needs to be good enough. But what exactly is good enough? Well, obviously, that's very subjective, but today we're going to talk about some things that we think will help you get to that good enough status. Now, before we continue, let's start off with some basics because, quite frankly, we're going to skip over some of the stuff we say all the time. Well, after we say it right now really quickly. So first, let's say you should have at least a half decent microphone. Shocking. We're going to say the AT2005, which I'm using right now, or the ATR 2100, or the Samsung Q2U. And as well, use a stand rather than hand palming it or holding it in your hand. That's called hand palming to avoid handling noise. But we should also quickly mention that you need to capture this in a decent sounding method. For example, capturing it through several adapters might lose quality along the way. Similarly, if you have a whiny or defective USB port, it could affect the USB quality going into your computer if you're recording on your computer. But the bottom line is you should have something that sounds reasonable to capture that audio. And you should also try to avoid recording in a space with a lot of ambient noise or echo. Sometimes that's not always the available case for you, but if you're in a room with multiple people, everybody should have their own microphone and don't share one. It'll be a lot better for the audio quality of your show, because if you're a podcast, you are predominantly doing audio versus anything else, and sound quality matters to the person that's listening in their car, in the gym, where at work, wherever they're listening. Audio quality could set you apart if you have two different shows to choose from, and one is poorer sounding audio and one is better sounding audio. That might be the difference between the two.
Now, before you even get to the gear, though, you should try to help yourself a little bit with the recording session. Here's some tips that we have that will hopefully help you sound a little bit better. The first one that we like to mention from an audio perspective is avoiding talking over each other. Now, this is a sort of a two-part reason. Number one is that anybody who's ever edited out over talking knows just how a couple people speaking at one time can make it sound unlistenable. The fun fact is that recently, actually, we've had a couple of interesting Gonna Geek shows where that's happened. I've recorded and it's been like, wow, this is crazy. This is not going to sound good. And then I end up getting into post-production and I'm able to take one of those voices out and it sounds a heck of a lot better. You can actually hear things. Now, with a little editing, this was able to be solved, but the host had to actually go ahead and be aware of this, because if everybody just kept talking, then I wouldn't have been able to edit that out properly. But instead, as the Gonna Geek show, somebody stopped talking. And so I was able to just take that person out who was not speaking. And thus it sounded very clean. Now, the other side of the over talking your host as well is because if you both are talking at one time, or all three people are talking at one time, you're not hearing each other. So you're constantly having to say, what? Can you say that again? And so then that, of course, can be a little bit unlistenable to a consumer.
Right. And this is also something that's important, at least I found that's important. If you can, avoid recording yourself and your music on the same track. You know, sometimes you might record and think that your music sounds well balanced in relation to your voice, but when you play it back, it's too loud and your voice is actually drowned out, or your co-host's voice is drowned out. Happens to me all the time with Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. So if you have a good, clean voice track in addition to the music track, meaning two separate tracks, you're multi-tracking, you can actually fix this in post. You can actually reinsert the music to the correct level, or you can take that recorded music and you can mitigate it down as well. And while we're talking about recording, you should also record at least with a 16-bit 44,100 hertz or higher. And fun fact, a lot of audio files are even pushing for 32-bit, and I assume in the future 64-bit, but you at least want to record with that 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz or higher.
You also want to go ahead and record your audio in a level that is reasonable. What I mean by that is around the minus 12 dB mark. Now, the thing why I say around that is because you want to make sure that when you speak, you're not clipping. You want to make sure to avoid clipping at all costs. But on the flip side, you don't want to be too quiet. If you go too quiet, what ends up happening is you're going to end up adding a bunch of line noise, which can be distracting to the listener.
Right, and if you happen to have a Zoom portable recorder, actually, I think the mix sound devices, Mix Pre 3 and 6, have this inherently in there as well. You can actually enable a secondary track that helps capture the audio at a set level lower. It's either minus 12 or minus 20 dB lower. So you can actually, and this is enabled primarily because of recording bands in a concert hall, and when they start overblowing the speakers, you might not have your recorder set low enough and it will clip like mad. Well, the same is true in podcasting. If you can enable those backup tracks at that lower level, you can actually save your podcast. You save that sentence or two while it's being clipped, and then you have to go in, you'll have to edit, and you'll have to insert that instead of the primary. But it is all possible, and actually I've done it before as well, before I got adept at setting the correct levels on my Zoom recorders. But it's important, as Steven said, that you don't record too quiet as well. I've had co-hosts that have been virtually, you can't hear them in their tracks, and you end up boosting the audio so much in post that the background noise, that hiss, that line noise really comes out. So you really don't want that. And speaking of line noise, make sure you're listening and monitoring during the recording for any hum or hiss or buzz or any other added line noise. You might need a ground loop isolator or a DI box with a ground lift, and that could help get rid of that. Or maybe it is the fact that you're plugged into the wrong outlet. If you want to change your plugs from port to port, meaning your actual AC plugs, if you're using a computer and other electronic devices, you can try that. But if it comes down to it and you've tried everything, you might want to try that ground loop isolator or a DI box and be able to get that cleaner audio to the recording. And by the way, we've seen an uptick in posts in podcast communities with listeners, not podcast producers, but listeners being aware of things like hum and buzz and other stuff. And we'll talk about that in a little second.
So what you're saying, SP, is that if I put a ground loop isolator in line, whenever I actually say hiss or hum, it'll get removed. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that for you, as long as you don't say hack, I think you should be okay.
One tip that we have if you are wanting to make your audio quality a little bit better is if you have to re-record or re-cue yourself, try to back up a little bit with what you're saying. It's amazing how many listeners will notice a sudden change in pitch or a sudden change in speed. Well, I just said that kind of the same, but they do notice these things. So they notice when you're editing and you're doing a sloppy job of it. And so it just sounds a little jarring to the listener. Fun fact, I've mentioned this before, that for my day job now, I do electronic learning modules for the company that I work for. Well, I actually had some learners come up to me and tell me that they really appreciated the modules that I was building because you couldn't hear when the voices were being re-recorded. These are just regular Joe and Jane schmoes out there. They noticed this in other people. And like, admittedly, obviously, I've got a little bit more audio experience than the random trainer next door that doesn't. But it was really interesting to hear regular learners say that they noticed that, which is the same with podcast consumers. Think about it. They're listening to podcasts, all of these different high quality podcasts. Yeah, you're going to stand out. So it's a really good idea to back up a little bit so that you can edit that and make that a little bit better, a little easier for the listener to listen to. One little tip that we have when you are editing is, if you can, try to edit together mid-word. Now, this will sometimes work, sometimes not work. But the reason it sometimes works mid-word is because as a listener, you're not expecting to have a sudden change with that. So it's in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a word, and you almost kind of have to fade them together a little bit. And you got to look for the right word, like if there is a sort of natural pause in the sentence. But it is amazing how much you can mask by editing together mid-word.
Right. So if you get those long sounds like S or the th or the f, those sorts of sounds, you'll see those in the waveform and they look just too fast. There's too much compression in the waveform, so it looks like a solid waveform. It doesn't actually look like a waveform when you're actually looking at it. You can cut at that specific spot and it might not sound as bad. So look for those S sounds, those TH sounds, those F sounds for those editing points as well. So that's my little audio tip. And by the way, Stephen, now that you have me watching The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, and you know, we have to text, we do a live text between us. You're making me do this in order to be able to do this podcast. I have to do that. The frankenbiting that goes on in those reality TV shows, it is really annoying once you become a podcast producer and you know what's going on, because when the camera shifts away from them and they show them actually saying, or you hear them saying something, they're not actually saying that right then. They've cut to another scene so that they could dub over audio that they've taken from some other time to throw in there. It's really annoying once you know what's going on. Anyway, if you can, utilize your mute switch when you aren't speaking. You know, it's amazing what can be captured in the recording, even when you follow these steps. So if you have desk bangs, sniffles, if you have lawnmowers in the back, using that mute switch while you aren't speaking really helps to avoid this. And I do this from time to time when I'm clearing my throat at home. I've got a little mute button on my mixer. I just press it. A cough button in a radio, it's called, in a radio station, it's called. You just press that, you clear your throat, you cough, you sneeze, whatever, and then you unmute that and you're good to go. And the audio recording is great afterwards in post. You have to remember to unmute yourself though, because there's been a couple of times where I've done, and Steven's done this as well, where we've actually started to speak and there's nothing that's coming out into the recording. So we actually have to reset, like Steven said before, reset and start the recording again. Matter of fact, let me give you an example why these sniffles and these coughs are annoying. Just today, as we were getting set to record, there was a post on a Reddit sub called Podcasts. It's not the podcasting subreddit that we like to send podcasters to, but this is a subreddit for listeners. I know there's similar Facebook groups for podcast listeners. And so there's different communities out there for fans of podcasts, for listeners of podcasts. And this is the post that was made today. What makes people think it's okay to chew and smack on their podcasts? I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I just needed to rant about this. I can't stand when you hear the person chewing, swallowing, or you can just hear their tongue clicking over and over. It is god awful, and so many podcasts are like this. That was a post today on the podcast subreddit.
Another thing that we want to mention here is that you should avoid totally using like those words that are like crutch word like things.
I thought they were actually crutches. Like you couldn't say crutches on your podcast.
No, seriously though, you want to avoid using crutch words because again, listeners will pick up on that. This is again, just something within your recording session that if you watch, it makes it easier for somebody who is listening to your podcast to enjoy. Right.
So we're going to move on to post-production and publishing tips. So at Better Podcasting, we recommend going with 96 kbps or higher for mono. And yes, we understand that 64 was standard for a long time, but there are more and more listeners who are finding this to be noticeable, especially with music elements. So 96 kilobits per second sounds better than 64 kilobits per second. I've done tests with this personally. Steven's done tests with this personally. Your average listener might not notice it, but if you get an audio file that's listening to your podcast, they will definitely notice that. And then if you're doing stereo, you should at least do 128 kilobits per second or higher. And personally, I would go ahead and go all the way up to that 192 kilobits per second or higher, because that is the 96 mono doubled into stereo. Now, where possible, try to use the Fraunhofer codec for the MP3 file. Now, it's less important than it used to be, but it does sound better than the lame encoder. And it's actually what the encoder is called, lame. And if you're using Audacity right now, you're still using that lame encoder. So if you can either port over a lossless file into iTunes and maybe actually convert that to MP3 in iTunes, that's a Fraunhofer encoder, or you can use something like we use with Movie Studio, or you can use Adobe Audition, anything that uses the Fraunhofer codec, it will sound a little bit better. Now, also compression can work well, and it can work against you as well. So it's amazing what a little compression can add to the recording to keep things even, but also bring out some of the flavor in the microphone. But don't over compress, because if you add too much compression, it'll sound really bad and really distorted. And basically you'll end up over modulating, or even it'll sound like you're clipping, and that's not great.
No, that would be a very, very bad thing. At this time, we're going to go ahead and say that you should also make sure that you have a decent level of audio. Now, we say that vaguely intentionally. The reason why we say that is because there is kind of sort of a standard right now of between what's called -14 and -16 LUFS, L-U-F-S, or LUFS if you would prefer. But the thing is, there's a bit of a dispute with the standard right now, and it's sort of in the middle of a fork in the road. It's going to clearly emerge. There's going to be somebody, but it is something that's recently changed. So we say -14 to -16, but the bottom line is you want to make sure that you're avoiding making your consumers turn up your volume all the way, or on the flip side, that your podcast comes on and they have to turn it down suddenly because you're blaring. So trying to make sure you sound like a lot of the other main shows out of there, but -14 to -16 LUFS is where you're supposed to be. That is technically kind of sort of the standard right now, but again, fork in the road.
Right. So just to give a little bit more information on that, Spotify, Alexa, if you happen to be on the Amazon architecture, if you have a skill in the Amazon architecture, or if you have a daily news brief on the Amazon architecture. And then there's also actual standards. There's the ITU-RBS.1770, and then also the EBU-R128 standard. So all of those standards have different actual levels of LUFS, and LUFS is a perceived level of audio. It's not actually, you can't convert that into dB, but they all have different ones. And that's why we're saying somewhere in between -14 and -16, you should be okay, at least for now, until one standard wins out amongst the others.
And also, just as a weird wrench in those plans as well, is it's important to note that there is technically a difference with mono audio as well, which is where it gets super weird also. So it's just like, that's why we were being intentionally vague.
Yeah, you have to be in that zone without actually blaring your ears out or making somebody turn the audio up. And what you don't want to happen is your audio is so quiet that the person listening can't turn it up loud enough to hear if they're in a subway, if they're in a bus, if they're in the car, if they're in the gym, and they've got all these noise around them and they simply can't hear you. That's what you want to really prevent. And you also don't want to blow anybody's ears out. But anyway, that is the audio standard as far as loudness, at least for now. Now, if you're going to use EQ or equalization, try to apply the majority of it in production rather than doing it in the signal chain during recording. This way, if you make your audio unlistenable because you added too much bass, you can fix it, because in post, it's just a setting and a plugin. Whereas if it's actually in the recording, you're never going to be able to truly get rid of that, aka Sterling Tribune episode number 1. So take advantage of noise reduction as well, but do it moderately, because, for example, Audacity has noise reduction and it can help avoid some of that background hiss that you have. However, if you do overdo it, you're going to sound distorted. You're going to sound like you're in a tin can or you're in some sort of cave somewhere. So you can best use noise reduction by leaving yourself a little bit of room noise before you start recording. That way you can actually, in Audacity, Audacity anyway, you can go in and you can select that 15 seconds of silence, and that could actually be the baseline for your actual noise reduction. You're going to have to do that because the shorter the time, the more of a error you can induce into the noise reduction plugin in Audacity.
Also, there are other plugins that might help you with your noise reduction. You might use one like the Isotope noise reducer. You might just find that a standard gating plugin. There's Waves has some amazing gating ones, can make a difference. Also, depending on where you're at, maybe you're in the middle of a hotel room and you got a little bit more reverb than normal. You might have to go in and use a plugin called SPL Deverb to help reduce that a little bit. So there's all sorts of noise plugins and ways to help reduce that audio noise.
Right. And finally, while you don't want to have a bad quality podcast, you really want to have a good quality audio sounding podcast. You don't want to make the file size so big that it's literally unlistenable because it's undownloadable. But it's so big that somebody can't fit it on their device. I know a lot of actual mobile plans have caps. If your file size is bigger than 100 megabytes, they'll say go to a Wi-Fi area before you're allowed to download that. And this is true of any apps that you're downloading, as well as podcast files, PDF files, whatever. So have your file, your finished audio file, under 100 megabytes. And we'll suggest more around 40 to 60 for a 1 hour show. I mean, I've done some that are like 75 or 80, but that's for like an hour and a half long show.
Overall, one of the best things that you can do to keep your audio listenable for your listeners is twofold. Number one, listen back to your podcast in a few different places. Use the car, use your home, use a smart speaker, use headphones, wherever. Just listen in a few different places and get a sample. What sort of things are you noticing standing out amongst all of these places? As well, ask somebody for feedback. If you can, ask a regular listener specifically about that. And try to be a little vague, but send them in the right direction. Is there anything distracting that you hear in my podcast? And they'll give you feedback.
Hold on a second. Johnny Pennington, if you're listening, is there anything in the show that is unlistenable, that is distracting for you? Just let us know.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, regular listener. Gotcha. But seriously, if you ask for the feedback, it'll be amazing what happens. Getting back to that story that I said earlier, I didn't even have to ask a regular person consuming one of my electronic modules, but they presented it. It's just great information that you can get by asking people. And it's important that you just strive to make your show listenable, but don't go for perfection because that can make you crazy.
It can, and it will consume your life. So don't do that. So listener, if you have any questions about audio quality that we haven't covered, please get them into us. Or if you have suggestions on your own that we have not covered yet in this episode, go ahead and hit us up at BetterPod on Twitter, podcast@betterpodcasting.com in email. And you can hit Stephen up on Facebook at facebook.com/betterpodcasting.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
All right, let's talk today about the wonderful world of Android. Those of you who are not using Android devices, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you're not using Android devices. I feel sorry for you. I feel bad. But what?
Sorry, I'm sorry. You said it two different ways. You said sorry and you said sorry. So
right.
what is it? I mean, are you sorry or are you sorry?
I just didn't want to alienate. Okay, I didn't want to alienate. I'm trying to bring our countries back together. I know we're feuding a lot lately, so just bringing them together. That's all. Try to bridge the gap.
Is that because your prime minister is a wimp? Is that what your deal is?
Oh,
Okay.
let's leave that alone. But no, seriously. So this is something that as an Android user, it's been a challenging experience as a podcast consumer as well, because I've had to go out and honestly, to date, while I've found podcast apps that I like, I never felt like I found the one that I wanted on the Android world. So Google, luckily, finally yesterday dropped the official Google Podcast app. Yay, I do fanfare here, but it's really not fanfare worthy because all it is essentially a launcher, a dedicated launcher to what we talked about previously, which was the Google search, which you had to have Google search 6.5 or higher, which I found out actually now needs 8.0 or higher. Actually, the search results that were in there that had the podcast integration, that's what they're banking on. So this app that you get in the Google Play Store just launches the podcast section that is within that Google search app. I've talked actually to the one and only Emily Prokop a little bit about her recent experience coming to the Android world, and she's been playing a lot with that Google search area. Now, there was actually a way that you could go and add a podcast icon from the essentially Google search app, but now this is a separate dedicated app called Google Podcasts. And when you click that button and you click the old podcast button that you generated from the Google search app, they go to the same place. So that's all it is it's really just a way to launch that and make that a little bit more widespread. So yes, this was announced yesterday, but those of you who have been experimenting with the Google search podcast integration, you're not going to find really anything new. If you want to go over to www.geeks.link/Google Podcasts, you can see I gave a bit of a first thoughts article about it. As a consumer who does largely listen in an area that's on the road, I primarily listen on the car, I have concerns over having to actually stream or individually download files. For me, it's not going to fit my use case, but I am excited about the prospect of there being a default Google app on Android. I think this offers massive potential for possibly getting a few extra ears into the podcast world because they get their phone, they see this app, and they go, oh, I've heard of these podcast things. This is how I get that. So that's exciting. Plus leveraging the Google algorithms, that's discoverability. I think there's massive potential there. On the flip side, we should say as a podcast creator, there is a little bit of question marks that some of us have run into in recently where they've put out a little bit of a checker, and we'll go ahead and put that at geeks.link/Google checker. We'll go ahead and do that. And you'll see that you can put your RSS feed in there. Well, there's 2 different podcasts within our just like group of 4 chat that we have in the background between 4 of us podcasters. And 2 of us are not indexed. So that means that for whatever reason, even though one of these podcasts, which I'll let SP tell you about, is actually just hosted on Libsyn and it meets all of the criteria, it's not indexed by Google.
No, it is not. And that would be my first podcast, Voices of Defiance. Now, it might be because I've got that URL actually pointed to a HTML coded site. It's not even a WordPress coded site. So that could be it. But I have tried to actually redirect it back to the Libsyn website, and I just haven't been successful. I'm not sure why. So we'll see next week if Voices of Defiance is actually indexed in the Google search or not. I will say that I thought it was there, and after you check it, it's not. It's a little bit disheartening, but you make your changes and you try to fix it, and you just go on with life. And you do want your podcast to be indexed in the Google search because a lot of people are going to be using it in the future. I mean, take a look at the actual breakout between how many people own Android phones and how many people own iPhones or iOS devices. Android is not anything that you should discount. It is a large portion of people that have mobile devices. So if you go to that site and your podcast does not show up in the checker as having a indexed URL RSS feed, you should probably go ahead and fix that.
Or try to, because there are some people who have followed the criteria and not been indexed. But again, this is in its infancy though, so I'm sure we'll get some expansion as it goes on. I did say that from my perspective, I can't really use it right now, but if they did add a feature where like auto downloaded the latest 2 episodes or latest whatever episodes, I would switch over because it's simple, it's clean, it's easy to use. I like the fact that it's not pulling from a catalog. Yes, there is the potential of missed or misfiled podcasts, ones that shouldn't be in there because Google's amazing and sees everything. It knows what color underwear you're wearing. But I like the idea of having Google's algorithm be the catalog rather than just like the Apple podcast directory. I like the lack of manual intervention. So I am looking forward to them hopefully appeasing one day the consumers like me so that I can switch over.
I'll say this for Google, though. In the past, I'd say about 2 years, maybe less than that, I've seen more positive movement forward in Google with podcasting than I've seen since I started podcasting. Yes, there was Google Listen. Yes, there was Google Play Music, but neither of those went anywhere. And at least they're still trying with this. So I will say to the Google development team, whatever backdoor deals that you have to do in order to get this done, we as podcasters really appreciate your attention to it.
The Google Play podcast thing is interesting. That's the other flag that's currently being thrown around a little bit is if that still exists, should I be in both directories? And that's basically, like I said, the red flag right there, because there are still probably people who are going to be using that and searching. So you might as well go ahead and try to get yourself in there if you can. Obviously, it's not available for all regions. I'd like to see it close down if they're going this one direction so that it's very clear where Android users should go.
Wait a minute. All podcasts will be on future One Direction albums? Is that what you just said?
I totally said that. Oh, and by the way, for those of you who are yelling at your iPods or your Android devices or your phones right now, yeah, we're aware. We didn't mention there's no real features like playlists. Apparently, that's the big hot topic right now. There's no playlists within there. It is a basic player. So those of you who like basic players will like it. I like basic players aside from a couple of extra features. I just would, I hope they keep evolving. So if you've tried this out, let us know your thoughts. Get in touch with us through any of the ways. You can go ahead and reach us at BetterPod on Twitter. You can go ahead and find us at facebook.com/betterpodcasting or head on over to betterpodcasting.com and comment on the latest episode there. If you want, you can always send us a video or an audio clip as well, and we'll hopefully play that on a future episode. Let's go ahead and get to our Better Pod back where we ran a bit of a poll. So, of course, on the heels of that news, we were going to run a little bit of a poll and solicit a bit of feedback about the consumption method that people have with their podcasts. So we asked the question, where you listen to podcasts, could you practically listen to them streamed, brackets, versus downloaded to your device automatically / manually? Now, we posted this on Twitter and Facebook. And SP, what were the results?
On Twitter, you had yes, stream away with 28%, and coming in as the majority winner with 72% of respondents, no, I need to listen to them offline. And actually, if I had a chance to respond to that, I would have added to that, no, I need to listen to them offline. So that should be a little bit higher. Over on Facebook, there were 2 answers as well. Yes, stream away. 27% of the respondents said yes, stream away, while 73% of respondents said no, I need them offline. So about 3/4 of the people that responded to our polls need to actually download their podcasts and listen to them offline.
We got a couple of tweets about it as well, including Jeremy Dennis that had suggested that we should have an option for both. His iCatcher app allows the setting on a per show basis, and he has it set as a mix. Shows that he needs to listen to even when offline get downloaded. New shows or ones that aren't at the top of the list get streamed. And then we clarified that we were looking for sort of, could you do it all or none? And that's what we were looking for. And so he said, yeah, if you're on all or none, it would definitely be a download for him. We also had Diami Paloki, woodworking expert, say, technically, yes, if I use my phone. However, I use a Wi-Fi only device, non-connected phone, as my media device, podcasts, Audible, Google Music. As I do most listening in the car, streaming is a non-starter for me. We also had Chris Jones say, I hope @Plex follows this poll for podcast feature priority, and then responded saying, but I'm with some of the others here. I need to download to save on data and coverage area / convenience. We had another tweet from the one and only Emily Prokop. Say what, SP?
I can't actually read this
Okay, that's
in her
fine.
voice because no, I'll read it. I'm just saying I can't read it in Emily's voice because I'm a male, but I'll try. Okay. So Emily, please don't be offended. I used to need them offline because my old workplace wouldn't give us the Wi-Fi password. Now that I have unlimited data and listen at home more, I'm fine with streaming.
Why does she sound like she's from the Bronx? Like, oh, SP, you should be ashamed of yourself.
I am ashamed. That's why I had to apologize beforehand.
Moving on from that, we had Adventures in Aurelia Pod say, seeing some of you got your guys' reasoning for the answer is download only. I could theoretically stream, but I do not have unlimited data plan and listen way too much to continue my habits as streamed only. And I think that's the demographic that they're really missing is the people who are specifically in an offline situation, like where they actually have to be offline, but also the people who consume a ton of content. And we've heard about these podcast consumers, but they are Google. Google's done their own research. I wrote that article that I referenced earlier. I'm of a different opinion, but Google's done their research, although their podcasting track record doesn't exactly show that their finger's always been on the pulse, but maybe.
Yeah, and Odd Dad Out on Twitter said, I listen at work and poor signal at some job sites make streaming nearly impossible at times. Never mind the battery drain of streaming for 8+ hours a night. So, yep, that is another use case. And once again, this is probably limited respondents in terms of like what Google's data shows, but it is a respondents to this podcast polls. And we look forward to Google perhaps enabling it in the future as they refine their app. In any case, I think it's a bonus to have the app available if it's going to be available as part of the normal. Like if you buy a new phone, that app would be actually on the screen. It would be great if that was the case as well. Don't know because we haven't had any new phones come out after this app has been put out.
Unrelated to the poll, we did get a tweet this week that we wanted to give a shout out to and say thank you to @podcastermike, who said, looking for some good podcast tips, go and listen to @BetterPod and anything @PodcastHelper does. #podcasting, #podcastlife. So thanks for the shout out on that. We always appreciate that. And if you found us through that tweet, thanks for checking us out.
Indeed. Thank you very much to anybody who had found us through that tweet. And it has been an exciting day here on the road. Just to give everybody a little heads up, my internet speed has been somewhere between 0.8 and 3 for the upload and download. So yes, you can podcast with this limited bandwidth, but I don't think I'd want to download podcasts with this bandwidth every week because it's taken a while. I had to download several podcasts when I updated my iPod yesterday, and it took like 3 hours to download all my podcasts. It's just like, really?
That's why you should definitely stream them. And then you only have to worry about buffering. So that's all you have to worry about is buffering. So there you go.
I hope you don't use truncate silence in this one.
Those people who have that enabled on their app are like, what's going on? Why is he laughing? So there you go. That's going to wrap up another episode of Better Podcasting. Before we do shut down, we do want to remind you we're part of the Gonna Geek Network. The Gonna Geek Network has a bunch of amazing geeky podcasts on it. We've got a lot of really, really awesome podcasts over there at gonnageeknetwork.com. A lot of fun people who enjoy talking about geekery, including Game Life Balance Australia. If you're looking for another Australian podcast, you can check out episode 61 of Game Life Balance Australia at gonnageeknetwork.com, where this week Rob has Billy Zane fever, and the only cure is a podcast about the classic arcade shooter. So if you know what that's about, check out Game Life Balance Australia at gonnageeknetwork.com. But for episode number 136 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen John Drew saying, yay, it wasn't me on the road this time. Woohoo!
And I'm SP saying, I don't think the Canadian Prime Minister is a wimp. See you guys next week.
Bye. See you later. Ter.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a Gonna Geek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.